Now let's look at how you can summarize data in a pivot table. When you combine options from the Summarize Values By and the Show Values As tabs on the Value Field Settings dialog box, it provides further insight into your data. For example, suppose that you want to calculate the total unit price of all the products that each warehouse is storing. You can do this by dragging the unit price field to the Values area of the pivot table field task pane. Notice that it has already calculated an overall total, and this is now visible in the pivot table in the worksheet. But how is this result being calculated? If you click the drop-down arrow for this field and click the Field Settings option to open the Value Field Settings dialog box, you can see that sum is the default function. You can change how Excel is analyzing the data by selecting a different function such as average. Now, whatever heading is added to the rows box, the overall total will be broken down into a series of subtotals by that heading. Drag the warehouse heading into the rows box and the pivot table then displays the sum of the unit prices found in each warehouse. Pivot tables are an excellent tool to quickly summarize large amounts of data, but because they are dynamic, it may seem difficult to use the pivot table results in other parts of your workbook. Fortunately, Excel has a function to do just that. You can retrieve results from pivot tables in other parts of your workbook using the getPivotData function. The syntax is getPivotData open parentheses, then the data field, the pivot table, and finally the fields and items. This syntax may seem complicated, but Excel simplifies the process of building the function by automatically inserting it. When you select a cell outside of the pivot table, even in another worksheet or workbook, and type the equal sign, then click on the field in the pivot table that contains the value you want to retrieve, Excel automatically inserts the getPivotData function with the correct syntax. For example, if you select cell D2, typing equals, then clicking on cell B9, which contains the sum of the value of the SKU 1567, it will create the getPivotData function automatically. The value of this function is that it will return the correct value as long as it remains visible in the pivot table. Now that we have seen how to use the Summarize Values By tab or the Value Field Settings dialog box, let's use the same example and suppose that you want to see the percentage of the total inventory value that each warehouse holds. You could do this calculation manually, but it would be easier to change how the values are shown. Within the Show Values As tab of the Value Field Settings dialog box, you would click the Percentage of Grand Total option from the Show Values As drop-down menu. You will now see what percentage of the grand total each warehouse holds. In this case, you can see that warehouse A contains products with a larger value, while warehouse C has the lowest value. When you are working with pivot tables, you will see two contextual tabs. Let's focus on the Design tab. In the Design tab, you can add layout elements to your pivot table, customize style options, and apply a style in the same way that you would with a regular table. You can modify these options at any time. But what if your data is outside of Excel? For example, an Excel spreadsheet can only hold 1.5 million rows of data. What if you're working with population data and you have millions of rows of data? If the data that you would like to analyze exists outside of Excel, such as in a Microsoft Access database, you can still use pivot tables to summarize it. To do this, use an already established connection to that data by opening the Create Pivot Table dialog box and then clicking the Use an External Data Source radio button. Next, click the Choose Connection button. In the Existing Connections dialog box, you can choose from existing connections that exist and browse for more connections. Now let's look at PowerPivot. PowerPivot is an add-in that is available for Excel 365. It is additional software that is included with some editions of Excel 365, but by default it is not enabled. When it is not included, it can be added later if required. After you install it, PowerPivot extends the functionality of Excel to allow for greater data analysis. What makes PowerPivot special is that it uses compression and processing algorithms that allow you to work efficiently with large amounts of data. This facilitates analysis with data that would otherwise be too cumbersome to work with. PowerPivot also facilitates the integration of data from multiple sources and has been designed with extra features and flexibility for environments that rely on Microsoft SharePoint and/or Microsoft SQL servers. So, does PowerPivot use the same functions that you are familiar with from working in Excel? PowerPivot draws data from multiple sources. Because it is analyzing information from 2 or more linked tables, it is what is known as a relational database. The Excel functions that you have seen in previous lessons are designed to work in the more limited environment of rows and columns in a workbook. PowerPivot creates its formulas and functions in a language called DAX, Data Analysis Expression, that can be used to work with relational data in a much more powerful manner. For example, this DAX expression joins two tables to return the total sales for the current quarter. You would use total QTD and the sum total of the employee's sales within a specific date range. You will find a brief summary of DAX categories of functions that you can access as a reading material after this video.